When the Bosnian Serb army surrounded the capital of Bosnia in 1992, Janine di Giovanni headed to the front lines to get a first-hand look at the effects of war.
The siege of Sarajevo, as a reporter, was an extraordinary moment in history to witness because it was so rich with human stories. I fell in love with the city and the people.
The conflict lasted for 3 years. During that time, Di Giovanni braved sniper fire and mortar rounds in order to show the world what was happening there.
We were living with people and on an everyday basis could document their courage, their resilience, their strength. It was a real testament to survival.
Since then, Di Giovanni has become a witness to some of the world's most atrocious wars, living in the midst of conflict zones and making it her life's work to expose crimes against humanity.
All I am is a witness. My role is to bring a voice to people who are voiceless.
A voice she has brought to conflicts across the world for more than 25 years, from Kosovo to Sierra Leone, Chechnya to Iraq, always up close and personal, often at the risk of her own safety.
I now cover Syria, and I started reporting it because I believe that it needs to be done. I believe a story there has to be told. I see again a template of the war in Bosnia.
In 2012, Di Giovanni embedded with locals, most of the time without bodyguards or security.
And we're talking to the people inside these conflicts, and we are recording their voices, their feelings, their sentiments. So I think in many ways what we do in real time is hugely essential to shaping policy. It's an extraordinary field where you're really able to shine a light into the darkest corners of the world. I can't believe that I get paid to do such an incredible job.
The IWMF is proud to present the 2016 Courage in Journalism Award to Janine di Giovanni.
One thing about being in war zones is the unexpected always happens.
Too many friends who've died, too many damaged to torture. The nature of journalism since the Arab Spring has changed drastically. The very experienced reporters don't want to do it. And what we're going to try to do is embed ourselves as people.
I think we should head home now. Yeah, let's head home. Heroes of Aleppo aren't the fighters. It's the people that are holding this city together, people who are feeding it and providing medical supplies. In a day, does he get many children that are killed?
Our car got surrounded by angry women making the sign, cutting the throat.
It is incredibly difficult work here, and that's why it's so important to do it.
The war in Syria is the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in history. It has been cited as that. So I'm going to really try to explain to you what happened in Syria, why it should matter to you, why it is urgent. I do understand that the Middle East is one of the most confusing regions in the world, and the Syrian war is so complicated that I have to put yellow Post-it notes up to kind of work out what militia is fighting what militia. The Syrian war was basically the last in the chain of pearls, as I put it, of the uprisings. And it started in the most simple way, really. It started in a city called Daraa, which is on the Jordanian and Syrian border. And it was a group of kids, literally kids who were 12, 13 years old. They were spray painting graffiti, and they wrote, "Doctor, you are next." And that was a reference to Bashar al-Assad, who is an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor. And they were basically saying, you're going to be the next dictator who's out of here. Assad decided to crack down on these kids with a ferocity that was, even by his standards, even by Syrian standards, vicious. He imprisoned these children. They were tortured brutally. And as a result, the town began to rise up. On Friday, the day of prayers, the Muslim day of prayers, is the day usually when people have demonstrations. And in Daraa, these demonstrations started, and they were very heavy. So Assad sent in his army to put them down. And they began shooting on the crowds. And they began basically going against the people. So very, very, very quickly, it turned from a peaceful demonstration into an armed conflict. Because what happened next was really horrible to watch, and I was on the ground. The film that you saw was mainly filmed in Aleppo, and Aleppo was the headquarters of the opposition. But very quickly, the opposition got diluted by jihadists, who basically took the revolution hostage. And it wasn't only one group of jihadists, it wasn't only the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria, which is called al-Nusra. It's, by the way, since been renamed, but I don't want to confuse you, we can just stick to al-Nusra. And then later, the Islamic State. One analyst estimated that there were 1,000 different battalions, all being funded by different proxy countries. So on the opposition side, you had different militias being funded by Qatar, Turkey, Kuwait, Saudi, and in some very small form, backed by the US. On the government side, you had the Assad regime being backed by Iran in the form of Hezbollah fighters, the militia Hezbollah, which is an Iranian Party of God fighters, and Russia. Now, Russia got much more involved in 2015. And the reason for this is that President Obama, whom I have huge respect for, really made a major tactical error when he decided that he was going to put Syria on the back burner. He underestimated the Islamic State, and he basically thought they're going to go away. They did not go away. They're never going to go away. But he thought that if we just leave it, they'll be contained. The second thing was that he basically felt that he had been elected on a platform of pulling out of war. So Obama, in his wisdom, thought, I'm not going to deal with this, and it turned into a monster. In 2013, there was a major chemical attack by Bashar al-Assad's forces onto Ghouta, which is a suburb outside of Damascus. He gassed women, children. It wasn't just gassing combatants, it was gassing civilians. And the UN said it was the worst chemical attack in 50 years. So at that moment, some of you may remember the red line. This was the red line. And Obama, in a very cowardly way, pushed it onto David Cameron, who in his own cowardly way pushed it onto Parliament, who abandoned, who didn't want it. And then Obama had a get-out clause saying, I can't go to war without my trusted ally, Great Britain. So we did nothing. And from that moment on, in 2013, the fate of Syria was sealed. So Russia saw an opportunity to come into Syria and use this as a way of a foothold of getting into the Middle East. Now, he says that this is about terrorism. In some ways, he has a point. Russia has experienced a lot of terrorism domestically, and their borders, if you look at a map, back up right against Ingushetia, Dagestan, all places where there's a lot of homebrewed terrorism. Chechnya. They fought their own wars with Chechnya in the early 2000s. I was in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, when it fell to Russian forces at the end of January 2000. And I have to tell you, you never, ever, ever want to be under a Russian aerial bombardment because they absolutely take no prisoners. They razed Grozny to the ground. And in that city, while I was still there, the few people that were left, many of them were ethnic Russians. So they were killing their own people, didn't care. Which is why when the Russians destroyed Aleppo last December, I knew that there was not going to be any regard for human life, civilians, children's hospitals. in September 2014, they began a bombing campaign aiding Assad's army and government. And they focused mainly on Aleppo. Why Aleppo? Aleppo is the seat of the opposition, and they also said that this is where they could really wipe out Nusra, Al-Qaeda, and elements of ISIS. What they did instead was basically target every school, every hospital facility, killing doctor after doctor after doctor, apartment buildings. So there's Aleppo, and that's the result of a carpet bombing, basically. Syria is the only war I've ever been in where I look around and there's no outside help. There's no UN, there's no doctors, there's no Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, NGOs, there's no one there. 11 million people are on the run from Syria. Now, 11 million people is half the pre-wartime population. So basically, 5 million of them are outside the country, heading towards Europe, in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan. The other 6 million are displaced from their homes inside Syria. So that's a complete refuge. And basically, for instance, when you break it down, it means that kids aren't in school. And children, for me, in any war zone, I always look at kids because I think they're the next generation. So even when we have a peace treaty, even when the war is over, what you still have to deal with is generational fallout. Kids that haven't gone to school in 6 years, that's the future of Syria. In 2014, I took some time out of being a reporter to go work for the UN on the Syrian refugee crisis as a humanitarian. Writing reports, basically, on projecting what would happen to this generation. And I have to tell you that it's just absolutely horrifying to think that we've got kids who, basically 6 years is grammar school. It's kindergarten to 6th grade, just gone. The other thing the refugee crisis does is it destabilizes the entire region. And again, you might think, well, why should we care about Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon? You should, because they're our Western allies. It's important for us that they don't collapse. We really, really don't want Lebanon to fall into another 17-year war. It's just emerged from one. Jordan is a very important buffer that we need. That is also hugely destabilized with a refugee camp there, which is now their 3rd largest city. Basically, the work that I do, I'm less a reporter and more of a human rights documenter, because what my aim is to document human rights abuse so that it could later be used in war crimes tribunals, which happened in Bosnia, and ultimately with the effect that we can affect policy. I don't think that will happen in Syria. It did happen. My colleagues and I worked very hard, and it did happen in Bosnia. Genocide, I think that if we reward Assad by letting him win the war, we're basically saying a man with so much blood on his hands who has committed genocide is going to be not held to accountability. So I think this will be the big argument, and perhaps why we might not have a negotiation. Because certainly the Russians want Assad to stay in place, and that means that we're going to have a leader who has committed genocide. Genocide is the intent to wipe out a population. So this is what happened in Rwanda. It's what happened in Srebrenica, Bosnia, where 8,000 Muslim men and boys were killed. I consider this a genocide. I think that there is potential for it to come to that. Will it be a war crimes tribunal? Eventually. But this is, first we really, really need to stabilize it, end the war, make it safe for refugees to go home. Many years ago, I was a young student. I had absolutely no intention to ever become a journalist. I was an academic, and I wanted to be a professor of literature. And I went to Israel, and I met a woman who changed my life forever. She is a human rights lawyer, Jewish, a survivor of the Holocaust. And she defended Palestinians in military court. And the reason I was so intrigued by her was that she was someone that never won. It wasn't even money. She never won a case. I think since 1967, since the occupation, she won 2 or 3 cases in court. She'd lost everything else. It intrigued me that someone could get up day after day, knowing that you were going to be shot down, but because you believed in justice, you did it. And she said something to me which basically has been the tenet and the core of my life, not just my work, but my life. And she said, if you have the ability to go somewhere and give a voice to people that do not have a voice, then you absolutely have an obligation. It's just a no-brainer. You have to do it. And she took me to a refugee camp. And it was the very first refugee camp I'd ever been in. And I don't know if any of you have ever had that experience, but if you ever do have a chance to, I urge you to, because you will never again turn on a light switch or take a shower or open your refrigerator in the same way. You will be forever grateful for what you have, because you will not believe the conditions that people live under and the fact that they have no voice, no justice, no one to complain to, nor anyone that cares.